So you will have seen that there are very few readings tonight, very few handouts, and I have much less material than usual. So it might be a short night. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but I've set up a couple of open-ended questions near the end to see how people are reacting to what we're talking about. So the topic tonight is the third turning of the Wheel of Dharma. And if you recall what I mentioned several weeks ago, this is still within Mahayana Buddhism. So there were two turnings within that form of Buddhism. So the Buddha promulgated the third and final turning of the Wheel of Dharma shortly before his death. I'm going to ask Sherry to read this first reading, but realize that this is quite densely written. And we'll be sort of unpacking it as the evening goes along. So don't worry if it doesn't make a lot of sense right off the bat. Oh, let me screen share. Sorry, what am I doing?
I was just going to ask.
There we go. Okay, thank you.
Okay. In places such as Mount Malaya, the point of enlightenment, and Vesali, at indeterminate times, and to the host of great, bodhisattvas,
yes,
who require the essential training, he, Gautama Buddha, excellently analyzed all things from form to omniscience in accord with the three essential natures of the imaginary.
Don't worry about the Sanskrit.
Okay, the imaginary, the dependent, and the absolute. And having established the nature of the ground, path, and result, he extensively revealed the abiding reality of the nucleus of the
Tathagata. Tathagata, which means suchness. Okay, thank you. So from this rather dense quotation, we can see that the essential content of the third turning has two major aspects. The first is the three essential natures, and the second is the Buddha nature. So I created this information fact sheet, if you like, to clue you in on the key components of this particular one. So let's just go through this. The Buddha's teachings on the three natures are found in this, I'm not able to pronounce this sutra, the sutra that elucidates the mystery. And they're given further expression in such sutras as the Lankavatara, which is the descent into Lanka, Lanka being Sri Lanka, I believe, and the Avatamsaka Sutra, the Flower Ornament Sutra. The Buddha's teachings on the Buddha nature are found in a number of sutras, including the Tathagata Garbha Sutra, which is the embryonic Tathagata, another one I'm not going to try and pronounce, and another one. Anyway, so the Sutra on the Lion's Roar of Queen Shrimala, and an analysis of the jewels and lineages, and the treatise on the Supreme. Life is a lot easier if you don't worry about the Sanskrit. But unfortunately, if you're reading about Buddhism, they make reference to the Sanskrit only a lot of the time, so you do have to become familiar with it. So the third turning teachings are systematized, elaborated, and explained in a series of commentaries and sub-commentaries by members of the Yogacara tradition. And this C is pronounced CH, even though it's only written with the C. Oops, what am I doing here? So, the most important member of the Yogacara movement was Asanga, who really founded it. He gave extensive teachings on the path and practice of the Bodhisattva itself. And you can see that there are two particularly important writings, Abhidharma Samukaya and the Bodhisattva Bhumi. These are some of the other people. Interestingly enough, his younger brother, Vasubandhu, ended up being just as important as he did, having written a commentary on Asanga's Abhidharma Samukaya, which is called the Abhidharma Kosha. And this is a very famous writing that you will see reference to all over the place if you do any reading in this. And so here are three or four other very important people, just in case you happen to run across their names. Okay. So Yogacara is a Buddhist school of idealism known for its doctrine of mind only. The basic contention of the school is that consciousness itself is the fundamental and only reality. And that's interesting. This is a conclusion that Sri Aurobindo came to as well. In this view, the apparent diversity of the empirical world is the product of instability and obscuration in the individual field of consciousness. Due to the effects of previous actions or karma, the most fundamental aspect of consciousness, which is called the storehouse consciousness or receptacle consciousness, in the Sanskrit this is an important term, alaya vinya, becomes tainted and unstable. The other aspects of consciousness, which are the five senses and thought, reinforce this mistaken perception. For the Yogacara adherent, enlightenment is achieved through the recognition of the alaya as the only reality, which leads to the cessation of dualistic imaginations. So why do we need a third turning? According to one of the main texts, the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, which was the Hinayana version, although true and profound, represents a provisional teaching. The second turning, while providing a more profound articulation of the Dharma than the first, also represents a provisional rather than an ultimate teaching. Only the third turning of the wheel of Dharma represents the Buddha's final statement and is thus to be taken as his ultimate and unsurpassable teaching. The first teaching taught the Four Noble Truths, while the second elucidated the doctrine that all phenomena are empty of self-nature. The third speaks about the world that appears once we realize that our conceptual versions are all empty. It is certainly true that, strictly speaking, nothing can be said about this reality because it's ineffable and beyond thought. Nevertheless, one can point, one can draw analogies, one can evoke that reality. And it's necessary to do this as a step beyond the second turning, because the negative language of the second turning could give the impression that ultimate reality is a nothingness, a blank void. But that is not what the second turning teachings are actually saying. In fact, they present the most refined and pure expression of emptiness one could ever imagine. Okay, Eva, would you like to read the second one for me?
Yet the relentless negativity of the language could, if unchecked, lead practitioners to a nihilistic viewpoint. It could allow them to think that everything is empty and meaningless, that nothing has any validity, that the spiritual path is bogus, and that they should turn to a life without the values or just give up and die. The ultimacy and finality of the third turning, in comparison to the second, is not that it presents a different reality from the second, but rather that its matter of articulating emptiness is more complete and less potentially misleading. From Indestructible Truth.
Okay, so it's going to put a positive spin on what you're left with once you think everything is empty. So the third turning calls our attention then to what remains in emptiness. It does this first through the doctrine of the so-called three natures. Like the second turning, the third recognizes the ultimate emptiness of self-nature in all of reality and the false covering of concepts that conceals it. In the third turning, however, a third category is added, that of dependent nature. Asanga argues that if we misunderstand our world through thinking about it, it is not the case that our concepts are labeling nothing at all, absolute non-being. Rather, they are labeling the ineffable world of thusness, or things as they are, as they're experienced by the Buddhas themselves. This ineffable world is a world of causes and conditions that the Buddha saw on the night of his enlightenment. This is the world he articulated in the doctrine of the 12 links described in the cycle of dependent origination. Remember all the diagrams I showed you with the 12 links in a circle? The three natures pave the way for what is the essential teaching of the third turning, that of Buddha nature, and that is known as Tathagata Garbha. The Buddha nature resides within the heart of every sentient being. So everybody on this call tonight has a Buddha nature deep inside themselves. The ones who didn't come tonight don't have it, but it is identical with the Dharmakaya, which is the mind of the enlightened ones. As it exists within all sentient beings, this Dharmakaya is fully developed and matured. The only difference between the Buddha nature as it exists in an ordinary sentient being like us and a fully enlightened Buddha is that in our case it is covered over by what they call adventitious defilements and goes by the name of Buddha nature. While in the case of those enlightened Buddhas, all the coverings have been removed, and it is now known as Dharmakaya, which means enlightenment and various other terms. So it's the same thing, except that the degree of awareness or clarity of that is significantly different. This Buddha nature is an expression within human beings of emptiness itself. However, the whole point of the third turning is that the Buddha nature is not nothing. Rather, it is endowed with the power of cognizance and other qualities that are inseparable from emptiness. So one of the images they use to help people grasp this is to think of the sky without any clouds in it at all. Perfectly blue sky. It appears to be empty, and yet it can have many things appear on its surface, if you like. In practical terms, when emptiness is realized, then all the Buddha qualities of wisdom and compassion with which the Buddha nature is endowed are free to express themselves. So the absolute nature, which is the perfected nature, refers to the mind which is resting in the ultimate. This corresponds to ultimate truth in the second turning, which I'm hoping you'll remember from the last talk. It is completely existent in the sense that the emptiness of realization is beyond birth and death. and is therefore indestructible. So here we have the two stages or two natures that were listed in the second turning. There was relative truth and ultimate truth. Now in the third turning, we're talking about natures, and there are three of them. And it's this dependent nature which is new. The absolute nature is an equivalent to ultimate truth, and the imaginary nature is a new name for relative truth. So if the imaginary nature corresponds to relative truth in the second turning, and the absolute nature up here, number 1, is analogous to ultimate truth, then how are we to understand dependent nature? So Asanga, who was the great Indian commentator on the third turning, poses an interesting question in this regard. So let's just jump back here and see if Linda Russell would read this one for me. Number 3.
Reading number 3. When we project a relative world made up of truly existing things, which are utterly non-existent, are we merely making this up based on nothing? Are we just projecting our concepts into a vacuum? Or might there be some substrate that is serving as a basis for our projections? Asanga says that there is indeed such a substrate, although it is not one that can be labeled or conceptualized. Because in that case, we would be right back into the imaginary nature, which is utterly non-existent. However, there is a substrate that is ineffable. This is the world of appearances that arise in accordance with the operation of karma. Reginald Ray.
Thank you. So based on this 3-level way of looking at things, I'll just go back here, this 3-level third turning way, we can describe samsara and nirvana in an illuminating way. Samsara is viewing the pure relative world, the dependent nature, through the filter of concepts by which we attribute self-nature to things. This is the imaginary nature. Nirvana consists in seeing the pure relative world, the dependent nature, as the Buddha did on his night of enlightenment, devoid of the imaginary nature. This is the absolute or perfected nature. The teachings of the three natures have important implications for the Buddhist path. They indicate that phenomenal experience is actually composed of two elements. On the one hand, there is the conceptualized overlay, the imaginary nature, which needs to be abandoned. But on the other hand, there is this substrate of karma, the dependent nature, that exists relatively and needs to be acknowledged and respected. By taking the ineffable substrate seriously, through being willing to travel through it like a walkway, there can be a path and eventually a transformation. As we will see in the Vajrayana form of Buddhism next week, the process of tantric meditation brings the pure relative truth of the world into view. On the one hand, through meditation on emptiness, one abandons one's own defiled conceptual versions of reality. On the other, through visualizing the world as the pure abode of the tantric deities, one realizes the splendor of manifestation beyond ego. The process is progressive. Through the visualization, one continually calls up the relative world in its non-conceptual purity. This brings about a process of gradual purification in which one is gradually disabused of one's view of reality as impure and laden with the conceptual dirt of ego. One's perception grows into sacred outlook, in which the truth of the pure dependent nature and its inseparability from the perfected nature are realized on a tantric level as the inseparability of appearance and emptiness. Now we're getting to the very goal of Buddhism, being able to see these two as inseparable. Okay, so let's turn to something a little easier to understand. And that's the Buddha nature. The second major teaching given by the Buddha in the third turning of the wheel of Dharma concerns the Buddha nature. Okay, in Tibet, the most important text on Buddha nature is the Uttara Tantra Shastra, a commentary attributed to the future Buddha Maitreya, who Baha'is believe is actually Bahá'u'lláh. The root verses by Maitreya are accompanied by Asanga's verse and prose commentary. It was brought to Tibet during the second spreading, so that was probably about 900 AD, and has become the subject of a number of important traditions of interpretation. So according to the Uttara Tantra, which is the treatise on the Supreme, within each sentient being is the actual nature of a Buddha. So this is not a seed that will one day grow into the full nature of a Buddha. Rather, it is at this moment that very nature, full grown. The nature of the Buddha is the Dharmakaya, the body of reality, the mind of enlightenment itself. So what is the Buddha nature like? Well, its essence is emptiness. Its nature is complete clarity and cognizance. It sees everything. And it manifests as compassion. It is this Dharmakaya, this enlightenment, already in itself mature and complete, that exists within the heart of all sentient beings, especially all the ones in this call. Why do we suffer then? If we human beings possess this enlightened core at our very basis, why are we so confused? And why do we suffer? The reason, according to the Uttara Tantra, is that the Buddha nature is covered over by defilements of all kinds. And you can think of the Baha'i teachings having to do with the mirror that needs to be polished. These defilements are adventitious, which means that they are inessential. They in no way actually damage or blemish the Buddha nature. They merely hide it from view. Thus we go about our lives feeling harassed and lost, unaware that this jewel of inestimable worth resides in our heart. Okie dokie. How about Harold, number 4?
Number 4. In the Uttara Tantra, many analogies are given to illustrate how the Buddha nature is covered over and hidden, yet never compromised or damaged. For example, the Buddha nature is said to be like an image of the Buddha wrapped in some dirty, tattered rags lying by the side of the road. The rags represent one's phenomenal personality, how one views oneself. When you first see it, it may seem like a worthless pile of garbage, which is certainly how we sometimes feel about ourselves. Yet when we look closely into this seemingly worthless rubbish, when we take the trouble to unwrap the rags around it, and we do this through the practice of meditation, we make the miraculous discovery of the resplendent Buddha within. Reginald Ray.
Thank you. So many Western Buddhists have a tendency to identify the Buddha nature with a mind that is open, clear, and expansive, that is untroubled by the chaos of experience. So this is certainly one basic way in which the Buddha nature can show itself, particularly through meditation practice. Many meditators are always looking for the Buddha nature as this unrestricted clarity, which brings with it a settled and peaceful feeling. But there is far more to the Buddha nature than this. It manifests itself in our lives in countless other ways. So let's pose a few questions to the Buddha nature. What is the intention of the Buddha nature? Well, apparently it is to lead us to or push us in the direction of full and perfect enlightenment. What is this enlightenment? It's our full presence to ourselves, our unbroken awareness of the fullness of our being, in which our compassion can flow forth spontaneously in whatever way it will, given our karma and our gifts. What stands in the way of this goal of spiritual maturation? Our mistaken concepts of ourselves, our rigid and defensive ego structures. What is an example of where the Buddha nature is at work? Well, in fact, the Buddha nature operates in all people all of the time. It is said that the universal experience of suffering is a manifestation of the Buddha nature. It is the message that our egoic versions of reality are inadequate and cannot bring about our lasting satisfaction or comfort. How does the Buddha nature move us forward? Well, through revealing to us the shabbiness and hollowness of the ego that we are trying to maintain. Through showing us the inadequacy of the ways in which we try to relieve pain and control our lives. So it's constantly on our case, trying to get us to break out of that pattern. Meditation practice is the primary Buddhist way for softening and relaxing the rigidity of the ego, and for providing space for awareness outside of the ego mechanism to grow. Yet the path of meditation is challenging. Why? Because it mostly consists of seeing through our own posturing and pride, unraveling our self-deception, and recovering dimensions of our person that, because of the pain cloaking them, we ignore and repress. Those who devote themselves to a life of meditation often find themselves face to face with the most difficult emotional upheavals and egoic inflations and deflations as their awareness grows and they integrate more of what they are in their totality. This vivid and often excruciating process is itself a manifestation of the Buddha nature. So the Buddha nature may often be behind certain dramatic occurrences, such as when a relationship collapses, or we lose a job, we fall gravely ill, someone close to us dies, or some other catastrophic event befalls us. At that moment, our carefully constructed and maintained world falls to pieces. At such a time, when everything else is more or less in complete disarray, the Buddha nature is there as openness, tenderness, and intelligence that transcends the ups and downs. Those who are aware of this can take great advantage of these so-called catastrophes, using them to deepen their own sense of being. Of course, positive experiences can also shatter our habitual world, the most notable being when one falls in love. The Buddha nature exists in all people, whether or not they are Buddhists, and regardless of the level of their commitment to a spiritual path. Though human beings try to ignore it, the Buddha nature is always in the background, trying to break through the walls of ego, to lead us to a deeper and fuller way of being. It is at the basis of who we are as human beings. Often the Buddha nature will break through in the most surprising and unexpected ways, causing the temporary demolition of aspects of our adaptation to life's circumstances. If people strongly resist the inner imperative to grow, the Buddha nature can manifest itself in even more drastic ways in which the consequences can be calamitous, at least from the ego's point of view. The Tantric Buddhist journey is directed at uncovering the Buddha nature within, which is not an easy or painless task. It has been said that in the journey to awakening, the Buddha nature does not particularly care what our personalities have to go through, or how difficult the process may be. Our deepest nature is uncompromising and will not let any of us stray very far from the path. It will ultimately put up with nothing short of enlightenment. Meditation is a way of creating a positive relationship with the Buddha nature so that the journey, while painful and challenging, at least continues in the direction of awakening and takes advantage of every turn in the road. So, as we'll see next week, one of the key practices of the Vajrayana Buddhism vehicle involves visualizing oneself as a fully enlightened Buddha. This visualization gives an imaginative representation to our own Buddha nature within, which is otherwise inaccessible. Through enacting the tantric liturgies, one's sense of being a separate egoic self gradually dissolves and is replaced by the Buddha nature. This is not a new identity and is nothing in common with the old egoic identity that is being released. So the equivalent for a Baha'i would be trying to imagine yourself as Abdu'l-Baha. What would he do in circumstance X, Y, or Z? Rather, it represents the ability to rest in the open, empty, cognizant nature that is the very core of our being. In the Vajrayana, one thus trains to live in terms of the Buddha nature, not thinking of oneself as a solid and discrete entity, and to act, but without the need for the aggrandizing strategies of the self-conscious I. In this way, the Vajrayana actualizes the teaching of the third turning of the wheel of Dharma. So, in this last section, I want us to talk about the Buddha nature and the Baha'i trust of God. In our first class of Part 3 in January this year, I drew your attention to Bahá'u'llah's concept of the trust of God, which is latent in the reality of every soul. And that is reading number 5. Marie, could you read this one for us, please?
Certainly. Men at all times and under all conditions stand in need of one to exhort them, guide them, and to instruct and teach them. Therefore, he hath sent forth his messengers, his prophets and chosen ones, that they might acquaint the people with the divine purpose underlying the revelation of books and the raising up of messengers, and that everyone may become aware of the trust of God, which is latent in the reality of every soul. Bahá'u'lláh, Masquid.
Okay. Thank you. So, as we near the end of this talk, I just want to leave you with 2 questions that we can hopefully discuss. The first question is this: is this trust of God the same entity as the soul in the Baha'i writings? And I'm going to follow that now with a quotation from Baha'u'lláh about the nature of the soul. So this is, let me see. How about Zilda? Number 6.
Okay. Reading number 6. Thou hast asked me concerning the nature of the soul. Know verily that the soul is a sign of God, a heavenly gem whose reality the most learned of men hath failed to grasp, and whose mystery no mind, however acute, can ever hope to unravel. It is the first among all created things to declare the excellence of its creator, the first to recognize his glory, to cleave to his truth, and to bow down in adoration before him. If it be faithful to God, it will reflect his light and will eventually return unto him. If it fail, however, in its allegiance to its creator, it will become a victim to self and passion and will, in the end, sink in their depths.
Thank you. Okay, so the first question is the trust of God that we read in number 5 the same entity as the soul in the Baha'i writings? And then the second question is, to what extent is the Buddha nature similar to Baha'u'llah's trust of God? Or are they different in entities altogether? And that's where I'm going to leave it. So, it's time for people to put their thinking caps on and see what they can come up with.
I could probably get us started. You know,
That-
Mark, it's
that would be
occurring to
great.
me- Yeah, regarding the soul and the trust of God, maybe there's a distinction in the Baha'i writings between the soul potential or the spiritual potential, which everyone has, and the actual soul, which, you know, is full of quirks and inadequacies. Just like that, you know, is that parallel to a distinction between Buddha nature in its pristine original form and the rags that are put on top of it by experience and ego and attachments of various kinds? It looks to me like there's some sort of a, you know, a hierarchy or a distinction in purity level, you know, that might be compared both within the Buddhist writings and the Baha'i writings.
Interesting. So we're talking about a spectrum of purity.
Perhaps. That's a hypothesis. I have
Interesting.
too many questions. I'll save some for later. I have too many questions.
Okay, good.
I'll save some.
Okay, Jack.
So Mark, you inspired me to all kinds of things when you were speaking. So I'll just, if you'll just give me a minute to share a few of them. So this thing about the Buddha nature, I've encountered this problem when speaking with my friend David Creighton here at the co-op. He's always talking about the Buddha nature. And of course, as a Baha'i, I tend to say, well, I believe that the Buddha was a qualitatively different kind of being, and that we will never attain the Buddha nature because the Buddha was, in Baha'i terms, a manifestation of God. But when the Buddhists are talking about the Buddha nature, they're in fact talking about this. I think they're not talking about themselves as a manifestation of God. I think they are talking about this trust of God, which I think is synonymous with the soul. And the soul, I mean, we just read the most perfect definition of the soul we can ever have from Baha'u'lláh. And as you've said also in the Buddhist teaching, Mark, it's covered. Now in the Baha'i and Sufi teaching, it's covered by veils. So Abdu'l-Baha is also always talking about the hijab, the veils being removed, right? And when those veils are removed, you see the eternal light filling the air. So that's where the confusion, comes in sometimes between the two different theologies. So this nature, what the Buddhists are calling the Buddha nature, also corresponds to what they call in French le point vierge, the virgin point of the soul, or the center of the soul, or the ser, the secret of the soul, which sort of lies at the center. And it is obscured by all of these different things that you've alluded to, right?
Mhm.
And then, but Baha'u'lláh says in the quote that we read on the soul, that if you don't exercise the soul in its faithfulness to God, you will sink in its depths. So this is a little different from the Buddhist teaching that you presented, that, you know, no matter how dirty the rags are, the soul is still there.
Mhm.
You don't get 55,000 reincarnations in a Baha'i understanding. You know, in Hinduism, they say there are as many reincarnations as there are hairs on the back of a cow. Well, that's a lot of reincarnations. We don't get that many chances. That's why this life is so terribly important. It's short, it's fast, but it's vitally important for our spiritual development. So Baha'u'lláh gives a kind of a warning about that, about exercising the faculties of the soul. But I think the writings are also clear that no matter what your state is when you die, even if you've ignored God all of your life and been quote unquote a sinful person, you can still make progress in the worlds beyond, right? Through the prayers of others or through your own efforts. I'm not sure how that works. That's a bit of a mysterious process. But anyway, those were some of the things. So when they talk about the Buddha nature, they're not saying we can all become Buddha. Well, in a way they are. Yeah, yes. Yeah, that's where the confusion is, I think. They say that we can all become Buddha. Isn't that sort of your understanding? So when in Zen they talk about Satori, here's the other thing. Now, in Zen Buddhism, Satori is their version of enlightenment.
Yep.
So when we're comparing the theologies, this is another difference, because enlightenment in Buddhism means seeing into your own nature. It's not something God bestows upon you, like when he chooses the manifestation of God. It's seeing into your own essence, or discovering your own true reality. That's an awakening. That's what Satori means in Zen. It's an awakening, and it's seeing into your own nature. Now, you helped me to understand something today, Mark. You've helped me to understand a lot of things over the years, I must say. When we talk about emptiness, now this is a strange concept for us Westerners. What's this big deal about emptiness? Isn't that a vacuum? Why are they always talking about emptiness? It's a strange concept for some of us to come to grips with.
Yeah.
Of course, in the Seven Valleys, Baha'u'lláh talks about the valley of absolute poverty and nothingness. And you can make parallels there, but you helped me with an insight tonight when you talked about emptiness and clarity. So emptiness is a kind of clarity, I think. It's a kind of pure light. When you see things like light is pure, light is the essence of purity. It reveals the essence of things, it reveals the nature of things, but in itself, it is completely pure. And when you talked about that, it gave me sort of a different insight into this, this Zen saying, I don't know if it's a Zen saying or not, sitting quietly doing nothing, sitting quietly doing nothing in that empty state and feeling empty but full at the same time. So that's the paradox. You're empty, but you're full. Anyway, those were just a few of the things that you inspired me with, Mark. So I must thank you for that.
As you were speaking, Jack, it made me want to come back to the Baha'i analogy of the mirror that we each possess. That's all covered over with crud. That it's our job to polish and polish and polish. So my own understanding of emptiness is a perfectly polished mirror that has
clarity again, right?
Yeah, where it is able to mirror anything perfectly.
Yeah.
Whatever comes, it sees without any distortion whatsoever. That's our goal as Baha'is, as far as I understand it. And I see a real parallel with what is being talked about in Buddhism as emptiness, which is really a misnomer to my mind. They should really be calling impermanence. That's why it's worthless, because it changes all the time. David Derrickson has a point to make.
Well, I think I do.
Okay. Let us be the judge of that.
Well, on what Jack was saying, I think there's perhaps another way of putting it that is simpler.
Okay.
First of all, it's the experience. It's the whole experience of emptiness.
Yeah, you can't convey
it. If we just talk about it, or if we use our reason in terms of rationality, that really doesn't quite get it.
Mm-hmm.
Because that rationality is more of an explanation of something. And you can't really explain the experience, a very deep experience, or here in the case of emptiness. I want to, what I had in mind was I have a short morning prayer of Bahá'u'lláh, and I think it perfectly exemplifies what we're talking about. And you all know it. I have wakened in thy shelter, O my God, and it becometh him who seeketh that shelter to abide within the sanctuary of thy protection and the stronghold of thy defense. What's the rest of it go?
Illumine my
Illumine,
oh my Lord.
I
Illumine my inner being, oh my Lord.
Yeah. Illumine my inner being, my Lord, with the splendors of the day spring of thy knowledge.
Revelation.
My outer being with the morning light of thy favor. And I remember once reciting that prayer, and my eyes were closed, and I came downstairs and I went outside, and all of a sudden, what I saw was the world so illumined, so bright, and so clear that it was like seeing it for the first time.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah. So you know, if you think about that short prayer, there are so many meanings within that. But to me, of all that Jack has said, which is fine, that prayer, to me, is the essence of the whole thing, of what Jack has said, of what we're all trying to say.
Mhm.
It's right there.
So you pierced through the veils on that day, David.
Yeah,
Well,
something.
we normally look outside and we just see what we see, and there's nothing illuminating about it but anything else. You know, we know it, we think we know it, we see it, its appearance. Okay, it's like saying, well, you know, you move into a neighborhood and it's new to you for the first time. What a lovely place this is. But then gradually, as you live in it, that first seeing gets clouded over. It's like saying, oh, there's a blindness in familiarity.
Yep.
And you know, and you go out of that neighborhood, and something happens. You come back into it, and all of a sudden you're seeing it differently again. You know, and so that's why I say, you know, what we perceive does indeed vary. But when it comes to, like I say, the reality of the world, reality of things, we can only really see what we think we see through that emptiness. And that's what I think that morning prayer shows.
Mhm. That's good. I can relate to a lot of what you just said.
Yeah.
To me, it's about seeing reality the way that God sees it. But because God is so transcendent, we have to say the way Bahá'u'lláh sees it, or how the way the Buddha sees it. Right? That's what we're trying to do, is to get rid of all the crap, all the concepts that we walk around with normally, and perceive things in that pure state that they were in. We got hands up. I have Harold and then Ingrid. Okay, Harold.
Ingrid first.
Oh,
Ingrid.
okay.
Great. Yeah, I just have a short comment. You know, you talk about the mirror image, Mark, but I wonder if another one that all the Baha'is will be familiar with is this concept of the hollow reed. So, you know, if the Buddha nature is like the hollow reed from which the pith of self, you know, has been removed, that I think is another valid image.
I agree.
I was thinking back to the Sri Aurobindo, and does the Buddha nature have anything to do with maybe the perfected self, or one of those, you know, one of those levels that we looked at? You know, I can't remember them, but is there a correlation at all between some of those?
I would say yes, there is. But the perfected nature is a term that was used by the Muslims and also by Abdu'l-Baha. So I would definitely say that there's a relationship there. There's probably also an equivalent term within Aurobindo's writings. I'm so locked into Buddhism right now, I can't shift gears in order to do that translation. But, I mean, I'm not sure if that would be supramental consciousness or slightly lower level. But it does bear looking into for sure. And the hollow reed, I mean, you're absolutely right. That works too. Okay, Harold, and then Jack.
Yeah, I want to come at this from another angle. You know, I happened to study that work called the Lion's Roar of Queen Shramala.
Okay.
And she talks about the Buddha nature as the womb of Buddhahood. At least that's how it's translated into the English text I read, the womb of Buddhahood. Now, to me, this is amazing. So this is, as I'm understanding it, she's emphasizing we have this inborn spiritual capacity to develop wisdom and compassion. And she, the fact that she was a woman to me is significant in this, because she ended up saying she was going to teach all the girls in her kingdom this doctrine. And the idea of the womb of Buddhahood is, it's saying small b, which is interesting, not capital B. The womb of Buddhahood means our potential to become compassionate and wise. And so that potential is cultivated by meditation and by education. So it puts the emphasis on the developmental aspect of Baha'is call this capacity building, maybe, or sometimes. So this is different than, I'm not saying I disagree with anything else said, but this is pointing to the developmental nature of Buddhahood. And to say universal, this is incredibly exciting. So every human being, male, female, has this capacity to be nurtured. The ideal society would set up opportunities for all of them to learn that. That book is amazing to me, the Lion's Roar of Queen Sharmila, the whole idea that she was a queen who heard a letter her parents wrote describing Buddhism, and she understood the letter better than her parents. And she started to give talks about it. And then she invited the Buddha. So she was, the story says she's a contemporary of the Buddha. She invited him to come hear one of her talks and said, am I getting it right? And the Buddha said, in the story says, not only are you getting it right, I'm going to have your version of this taught to my monks back home. Something like, so I'm paraphrasing. But it's a super exciting, you see, here's what I worry though. I think I'm bringing a Western Enlightenment view to this. In other words, it's exciting to me that every human being, Buddhist or not, girl or boy, has this spiritual capacity. So this is a different way of thinking about it. It's something to be cultivated. So to use the mirror analogy, so the mirror will definitely get blemishes, and unless there's some sort of constant vigilance to clear it. And so you have to set up a nurturing educational system, meditative discipline from the beginning, from the get-go, with our Buddha nature, lest it go astray. So I'm seeing this Buddha nature in a very developmental mode, you know, super exciting, you know, across disciplines and across religious outlooks. But if you start spelling Buddha nature with a capital B, I think you get into these, you know, theological conundrums that Jack was referring to. In the book I had, it was always spelled with a small b, which really helped me get it better. Buddha nature, small b, the womb of Buddhahood, something lying in potential, a seed. Anyway, enough on that. But yeah, so that's another angle on this concept.
Brilliant. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Jack,
I agree, Harold, with everything you've said, and small b with Buddhahood. I wanted just to make a couple of comments again in the comparative religion aspect. Now, in Buddhism, they're emphasizing a lot meditation as the path to enlightenment. Now, in the Baha'i faith, that's just one tool. It's not the only tool. We have study, we have prayer, we have meditation, and what is unique in the faith today is that we have action. And when Alan Rayner was on pilgrimage in 1957, the year Shoghi Effendi died, and by the way, he told me that nothing could, whatever on earth could have prepared him to meet Shoghi Effendi, who was quite an extraordinary human being. Never mind Abdul Baha and Bahá'u'lláh. So it must have been such a shock for the pilgrims sitting at that table when suddenly Shoghi Effendi said, prayer is useless. Long pause. Meditation is useless. Another long pause. Then prayer and meditation without action are useless. So that's another path to spirituality too, is being actively engaged, as Baha'is would say these days, in community building. So the second point I wanted to make was going back to David's very mystical, illuminating experience when, after saying that morning prayer, he walked outside and saw the world, as Cat Stevens says, as you know, in his song, morning has broken like the first morning. And there was a spoken word poet, Steve, what was his last name? Steve Sauvé. I went to hear him one time. He died young, unfortunately, of a heart ailment, but he wrote a wonderful poem, and he said, don't live every day as if it's your last day. Live every day as if it's your first day. So that's a very interesting concept in itself. Now, I may have forgotten the point of what I wanted to say, but yeah, whether it's polishing the mirror or removing the veils, and you know, the interesting thing about the veils, using the paradox again, which is so characteristic of mystical language, the paradox is, there's a saying, I don't know if it's Islamic, it's probably Islamic or Baha'i, that God is hidden in 1,000 or 10,000 veils of light. Now, when you think about that, it makes no sense at all at first, because light is something that's supposed to reveal the nature of things. But in this case, paradoxically, God hides himself in veils of light, because, and Ingrid, I remember, mentioned one time about there's some points on the light spectrum which are not visible to us. And that also is a very, very interesting concept if we're talking about the reality, about the analogy of light.
That
Anyway,
as you were saying that, Jack, it makes me think of the concept in Sufism of black light. And that is light which is so intense that we cannot even see it. So that's
maybe
the
that's why
10,000 veils.
Yeah, is that why the mystics talk about the dazzling darkness that they see?
Yep.
Again, there's the paradox, dazzling darkness.
And it's a beautiful image for ineffability, right? Which is what David is talking about, that these are things that you cannot really convey with words. You have to actually experience it for it to have its true meaning for you. So, I mean, here I have been talking my face off for hours and hours and hours and hours, where all I'm doing is pointing at the moon. That's all I'm trying to do. That's all that human language is capable of.
That makes me think of
You're muted.
no, I'm not.
Oh.
That makes me think of an illustration on a book by Jacob Gronowski.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It's a book about knowledge and consciousness and experience. And the cover shows the moon up there and a man on Earth with a ladder. And he's going up the ladder and says, I want.
Yep.
I think it's right. See, look, you know, you know, understanding does not come at first through the mind in terms of that, the faculty of reason, the rationale. It does not. It comes through what we call the heart, and you know, and that's another thing that I think very few of us understand anyway. But you see, when you experience that illumination, which is what that was for me, everything was so clear, everything was so bright, you know, that, you know, it was like seeing everything for the first time, the whole of creation, the universe. However, you know, when you experience this and there's that understanding, language disappears. Language simply disappears. There's no more necessity for it at all.
Yep.
It simply goes. And then, you know, so there we go with emptiness again, you see. And so we all know language is very important to us, you know, in this world, obviously. But it's also a point of confusion depending how you use it.
Oh.
But the thing is that the spirituality of language is another thing. And that's, but when it comes to this experience, the experience of emptiness, or whatever you want, language simply disappears. And everything is silence. You know, so that what we're talking about is, well, how the hell do we live? You know, how do we live with this? How is this going to you know, bring, together the whole of humanity, to unify humanity, you know, and our whole conduct and behavior after that.
You know,
So-
one of the things I'm thinking, David, as you're talking, is that I'm hoping that we become much better listeners,
Yeah. Yeah.
capable of being silent, and not
Right.
just not speaking, but not
Yeah.
thinking, but listening with all we have to what another person is saying,
Right. Yeah.
so that they feel heard in their deepest core.
Yeah.
And then we respond appropriately. I don't know. Joey, what are you thinking?
She's got her hand up.
Still muted.
No, I'm,
Oh,
There she goes.
I was thinking what David had said just really struck me, that the language of spirituality, I feel, is sometimes where religions come into conflict. But the experience of spirituality is where we find the common ground.
Yes.
but at the same time, as soon as we try to tell anybody about the experience, what do? We adopt our own concepts, our own religious background. We bring that all up to the surface. We filter the raw thing through the place where we're most comfortable. So, like Bahá'u'lláh says, I mean, if you're shining a clear light and it goes through a red globe, it comes out red. If you go through a yellow one, it comes out yellow. So that's the basic idea here. As long as we're just having the experience and we stop there, that doesn't necessarily come into play. But as soon as we start thinking about it, think about how we would tell anybody else about it, all that other baggage comes in.
Yeah.
But maybe that's where the Buddhist philosophy of emptiness plays a part, where if we're open to that empty nature and others are, they will share that experience rather than through language. Language is where we get in trouble, I think, all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why the Quakers do a silent meditation and the Buddhists also do a silent meditation. And I just wanted to add, Mark, when you included that very perfect definition of Bahá'u'lláh of the soul, the description of the soul, that it's a profound mystery that we will never, ever be able to fathom because the soul is a perfect creation of God. He says it is the first among all created things to bow down in adoration before him.
That's right.
And I would just like to point out that that is not symbolic. When you read about religious, spiritual, mystical experiences, for example, of the prophets, you think of Daniel falling on his face before the glory of the Lord on the river Tigris. These are not just symbolic things. And I once experienced in prayer this very unusual experience this day of being forced onto my knees, literally by a power in the room. In other words, I could not stand in the face of that power. I remember Douglas Martin saying, he didn't approve of all the gesticulating and crying and bowing down and being a Western individual and a Canadian that went on during pilgrimage. And he said, when he went into the shrine, he said it was like somebody grabbed him behind the neck and pushed him down on the floor. So, these are real, I think, although the language is poetical and we all agree that language can never fully capture spiritual experience, these things nonetheless describe very real spiritual states, and bowing down in adoration of the soul before its creator is one of them that Baha'u'lláh mentions in. And of course we do it, in the long obligatory prayer and bowing down, when we pray. And in Buddhism, I think there's a bowing ceremony, is there not, in one of the branches, and so on and so forth. So these are real states of the soul that manifest through the body.
Yeah. Oh, good.
Go ahead, David.
Thoughts? I remember Abdul Baha saying that thoughts are forces. And I know that the Buddha would agree with that because, what we think has a lot to do with what we do, our own behavior, and how it influences our fellow human beings. But in terms of the spiritual nature, of the spiritual reality, it is true that everybody is not equal in terms, in this world, in terms of their understanding, in terms of one thing and another, but, if people are all on the spiritual path in their own way, the experience and the attitude of one person can and will affect another person. And so that we all affect one another in very invisible ways. much more than we recognize. So, and I think that that this is very important. You know, we can quote the writings, we can talk about, you know, a lot of different things that we have experienced, or Jack experienced. But then the first thing after that is really to experience it. If we can't experience it, then we don't know, we don't really understand. We simply just don't. And there's a lot in the natural world that shows this, that indicates this. But you know, this is something that we human beings have to become aware of, have to be conscious of. So I say once again, you know, in this sense, you know, what do we mean by awareness or consciousness? And there are many degrees of that. You know, this is why I say, you know, it's we're talking about invisible things. Invisible things affect visible things. So, you know, I just feel that I have a book, and I forget, it's a very small book that's on Buddhism, but it's all shown in pictures.
Really?
Yeah, it involves an ox, and
You can't ever show me that book.
the very end. They have all these pictures, and at the very end is just a simple circle with nothing in it.
Yeah, that's the 10 ox herding pictures, I think.
Yeah, I just get his name, but I have the book. I have
You've never
enough.
shown it to me.
Well, if I show it to you, I'll never see it again.
You should have memorized it by now.
Yeah. No, I have another book that called Tibetan Mysticism. And I've had this book for many, many, many years. And this book is extremely reliable, and it's based on you know, I get, you know, it's based on the Om saying.
Oh,
Om Mani Padme Hum.
Mhm.
The whole book is based on that.
Yeah.
you haven't shown me that book either.
Well, if I show it to you, I'll never see it again. And so, and
You guys don't get
somehow,
along that well, eh?
when it comes when it comes to Hum, you know, he has pages which me as a Baha'i indicate that where he is showing actually what a manifestation of God is.
Mhm.
Believe it or not, he does this, and I've never seen anything like it before. And
Well, what you're referring to, David, is called Mantrayana. It's another version of Buddhism that focuses on the power of sound.
right,
And that can be channeled in a way to change realities for people around you, etc.
Om Mani Padme Hum. Yeah.
Yeah.
But this book doesn't explain, but just says from the Hum part of it what a manifestation of God is. Well, that's how I interpret it. And if I get a chance, I would like to somehow copy these pages and into Word and send it to everybody, because it is utterly fantastic, you know, and it's right on.
Well, if you get a chance to type it up, send
Yeah.
it to me, and I can distribute it to everybody.
Okay, all right.
Easy peasy.
You know, Mark,
Okay.
I think David is right that we influence one another. I mean, we all talk a lot. And, well, I do. Some of us talk a lot, give explanations and teach and this and that. But I think David is very right that we also influence one another deeply in subtle ways and invisible ways, you know, as much as the overt ways. And for example, when I look at all of your beautiful faces, I get very inspired just by looking at all of you, you know. I have such admiration for all of you. So these are subtle things, these are invisible things that play in the heart. The last thing I'll say, and I promise it'll be the last thing, was when I was a young man, I met Stanwood Cobb. I had the good fortune of meeting Stanwood Cobb, who met Abdu'l-Baha 5 times. And he talked about that. And the first time, if I remember correctly, the first time he met Abdu'l-Baha, that was in either Haifa or Akka. When he walked into the room, he couldn't see Abdu'l-Baha. He saw nothing but light. He couldn't see the form of Abdu'l-Baha even. He saw nothing but light. And so obviously he had the capacity to see that, or the veils were removed, I don't know which. And it was only when he approached the physical being of Abdu'l-Baha that he was able to see him. So, you know, it's not without reason that all of the paintings of the holy figures have, you know, this halo, you know, around the head, because that is it's an actual visual experience for some people. They can see different colors in the aura and so on.
Well, I can see that we've run out of time.
Can we have another minute?
Do we have another minute?
Yeah, I just, when
okay.
Jack brought up Stanwood Cobb,
yeah,
it reminded me that we have this book. I don't think you could tell the title.
Oh, did he? Yeah.
And it's called Patterns in Jade of Wu Ming Fu, which was something Stanwood Cobb wrote. And guess what?
Yeah.
It's quite old, but it's in really great condition. Beautiful paper. And inside the front cover, and again, you aren't going to be able to see this properly, but Stanwood Cobb signed it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think I know how we came into possession of this book. What I'm wondering about is what to do with it, because it really needs to go to an archive.
To bookmark it.
No, I didn't get through bookmark.
Oh, yeah.
But I think someone put the book into a sale at a summer school sometime or other, and didn't realize what they had. But yeah, I think this book actually needs to go into an archive, because I don't imagine there's too many copies of it floating around anymore, much less with Stanwood Cobb's signature.
Now, does that have a Buddhist influence, that particular book?
It might. He certainly is using the image of the wisdom of the East as a way of conveying a message. Because he has, and again, you aren't going to be able to see this terribly well. Yeah. Little image there of a wise Buddha type looking person. And it's
but it's really, but what he writes there is really about Baha'u'llah's teachings.
Yeah, really, actually,
it really is. But it's yeah, but and it's all aphoristic.
Yeah, this is a series of little. For instance, this one's called Testing. A day's journey will test the strength of a horse. A single meal will prove the ability of a cook, but it takes many years, nay, life itself, to demonstrate the true character of a man. And then he has at the end, he has a description of Wu Ming Fu was a true cosmopolite, as much at home in the civilization of the Occident as that of the Orient. And I'm betting he's thinking about Baha here. Deeply versed in Asiatic philosophy, He was also the product of the American University. Might have been thinking about Shoghi Effendi there too. But he's doing this as if this person was actually real, whereas I think he's actually fictional, or a composite of Abdu'l-Baha, Shoghi Effendi, and Mr. Cobb's imagination.
Okay, Ingrid, you have the last comment or question.
I just want to say to David's point, I know quite a bit about the Om Mani Padme Hum. It's called the 6 true words mantra. It's also called the mantra of compassion. And it's loosely translated to this: I see the God within you, and I acknowledge and bow to that light. So I just thought people would be interested in that.
Thank you very much.
That would be the Buddha nature.
Right, right.
Well, folks, shall we close her down? Okay.
Well, we don't want to close it down. We just continue it afterwards.
Okay, go ahead.
But it does give you a different, in a way, a different light, so to speak, on spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
And what we think it is. The word gets bandied about all the time, so that often we don't know what we're talking about.
Not in this course.
This is quite a nice conversation.
Yeah, it's really great.
Okay.
Very
And thank you, Mark,
nourishing.
thank you, Mark, for stretching our horizons.
We stretched.
There's more to go.
Okay.
Yes, it is a good conversation, and I hope Marie and everybody else just loves it tonight.
Love you all.
Okay, guys. We
Okay.
shall see you in a week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
Bye. Maybe bye. See you.
I don't care. It doesn't work out.